Good day, everyone. I am Jake Mercabal, a third-year BS Psychology student of President Ramon Magsaysay State University. And today, we are going to discuss and get to know Sigmund Freud and his psychoanalytic approach. So let's dive in. Psychoanalytic approach. So his system of psychoanalysis was the first formal theory of personality and is still the best known. The earliest approach to the formal study of personality was psychoanalysis, the creation of Sigmund, who began his work in the closing years of the 19th century. So psychoanalysis, as Freud conceived it, emphasizes unconscious forces, biologically based drives of sex and aggression, and unavoidable conflicts in the early childhood. So these were considered the rulers and shapers of our personality. In the early years, Freud was born in 1856 in Freiburg, Moravia, which is now the town of Freiburg in the Czech Republic. His father was a relatively unsuccessful wool merchant, and when his business failed in Moravia, he moved the family to Leipzig, Germany. The father was a strict and authoritarian and also felt superior towards his father as early as age 2. So Freud's mother was very attractive and she was extremely protective and loving towards Sigmund, which is her first son. Freud felt a passionate and even sexual attachment to her, a relationship that set the stage for his concept of the Oedipus complex. The cocaine episode. While in medical school, Freud began to experiment with cocaine, which at that time was not an illegal substance, and he took the drug himself and persuaded his fiancée, sisters, and friends to try it. Quote unquote, he continued to use cocaine to make bad days good and good days better. In 1884, he published an article about cocaine's beneficial effects, which was criticized by people and researchers about it. However, he continued to use cocaine while into middle age. He apparently took it from 1884 to 1896 and then switched to wine. Finding the sexual basis of neurosis. Freud established practice as a clinical neurologist in 1881 and began his exploration of the personalities of people suffering from emotional disorders. So he studied several months in Paris with the psychiatrist Jean-Martin Charcot, a pioneer in the use of hypnosis, who alerted Freud to the possible sexual basis of neurosis. When Freud returned to Vienna, he was again reminded of the possible sexual origin of emotional problems, and Freud was led to consider the possibility of a sexual basis for emotional disturbance. Childhood sexual abuse. Is it a fact or fantasy? After several years in clinical practice, he was increasingly convinced that the sexual conflicts were the primary cause of all neuroses. These events resembled seduction with the seducer, usually being an older male relative, typically the father. Today, we call such experiences child abuse, and they often involve rape or incest. So Freud believed that it was the early sexual traumas that caused neurotic behavior in adulthood. Freud changed his mind and announced that in most cases, the childhood sexual abuse his patients told him about had never really happened, and they had been telling him fantasies, and Freud claimed. Freud changed his position on the seduction theory because he realized that if sexual abuse was so widespread, then many fathers, including perhaps his own, would be considered suspect of perverse acts against their children. Freud's own sex life. It is a paradox that Freud, who emphasized the importance of sex in emotional life, because he had no contact with members of the opposite sex throughout his early years. So he was decidedly shy and afraid of women and was a virgin when he married at age 30. So his attitude towards sex was negative, wrote about the dangers of sex, even those who were not neurotic, and urged people to rise above of what he called the common animal need for sex. Sex act was degrading, he wrote, because it contaminated both mind and body. He occasionally had been impotent during his marriage and had sometimes chosen to abstain from sex because he disliked condoms and coitus interruptus, the standard birth control methods of the day. Freud blamed his wife, Martha, for the termination of his sex life, and for many years, he had dreams involving his resentment toward her for forcing him to abandon sex. Freud's periods of impotence may also have been related to his fear that Martha would become pregnant again. Freud's neurotic episode. Freud's personal frustrations and conflicts about sex surface in the form of neuroses. In the same way, he believes sexual difficulties affect his patient. Freud diagnosed his condition as anxiety, neurosis, and neurasthenia, neurotic condition characterized by weakness, worry, and disturbances of digestion and circulation. Analyzing Freud's dreams. Freud psychoanalyzed himself to do the study of his own dreams, a process he continued for the rest of his life. He recalled his childhood sexual longings for his mother and dreamed of a sex wish towards his eldest daughter. Thus, he formulated much of his theory around his own neurotic conflicts and childhood experiences, as filtered to do his interpretations of his dreams. Freud's ideas attract attention. Freud attracted a group of disciples who met with him once a week to learn about his new systems. The disciples include Carl Jung and Alfred Adler, who later broke with Freud to develop their own theories. Freud considered them traitors to the cause, and he never forgave them for disputing his approach to psychoanalysis. At a family dinner, he complained about his followers' disloyalty. Freud comes to America. In 1909, Freud received formal recognition from the American psychological community, which his psychoanalysis was warmly welcomed in the United States. In 1920, only 11 years after his visit to America, more than 200 books on his work had been published in the United States. The final years. During the 1920s and 1930s, he reached the pinnacle of his success, but at the same time, his health began to deteriorate seriously. From 1923 until his death 16 years later, he underwent 33 operations for cancer of the mouth, perhaps as a result of his smoking 20 cigars daily. When the Nazis came to power in Germany in 1933, they publicly burned Freud's book and other so-called enemies of the state, such as the physicist Albert Einstein and the writer Ernest Hemingway. He administered 3 injections of morphine over the next 24 hours. Instincts, the propelling forces of the personality. In Freud's system, mental representations of internal stimuli, such as hunger, that drive a person to take a certain actions. While the two types of instincts, first, the life instinct serves the purpose of survival of the individual and the species, by seeking to satisfy the needs for food, water, air, and sex. While libido to Freud, the form of psychic energy manifested by the life instincts that drives a person toward pleasurable behaviors and thoughts, while the other one is the death instincts, the unconscious drive toward decay, destruction, and aggression. Under it is the aggressive drive, the compulsion to destroy, conquer, and kill. The levels of personality. Freud's original conception divided personality into 3 levels: the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious. The conscious, as Freud defined term, corresponds to its ordinary everyday meaning. It includes all the sensations and experiences of which we are aware at any given moment. To be a limited aspect of personality because only a small portion of our thoughts, sensations, and memories exist in conscious awareness at any one time. The unconscious, however, that larger, invisible portion below the surface, this is the focus of psychoanalytic theory. While between of these 2 levels is the preconscious. This is the storehouse of all our memories, perceptions, and thoughts of which we are not consciously aware, and at that moment, but we can be easily summoned into consciousness. The structure of personality. The id is the aspect of personality allied with the instincts, which is the source of psychic energy, and the id operates according to the pleasure principle. While the pleasure principle is the principle by which the id functions to avoid pain and maximize pleasure. This is also the primary process taught child-like thinking, by which the id attempts to satisfy the instinctual drives. While the ego, the rational aspect of the personality, responsible for directing and controlling the instincts according to the reality principle. The reality principle is the principle by which the ego functions to provide appropriate constraints on the expression of the id instincts. This is also the secondary process thought, mature thought process needed to deal rationally with the external world. While the last one is the superego. The superego is the moral aspect of personality, the internalization of parental and societal values and standards. Conscience is a component of the superego that contains behavior for which the child has been punished. So ego ideal is a component of the superego that contains the moral and ideal behaviors for which a person should drive. Anxiety, a threat to the ego. Anxiety is not unlike fear, but we may not know what we're afraid of. Freud described anxiety as an objectless fear, meaning that we cannot point to its source, to a specific object that caused it. Infantile helplessness is reenacted to some degree whenever the ego is threatened. Freud proposed three different types of anxiety: the reality, neurotic, and moral anxiety. The reality anxiety involves a fear of real dangers in the real world. Most of us justifiably fear fires, hurricanes, earthquakes, and similar disasters. We run from wild animals, jump out the paths of speeding cars, and run out of burning buildings. While the neurotic anxiety has its basis in childhood, in a conflict between instinctual gratification and reality. This neurotic anxiety is an unconscious fear of being punished from impulsively displaying id-dominated behavior. While the moral anxiety, it is resolved from a conflict between the id and the superego. In essence, it is fear of one's conscience. Moral anxiety is a function of how well developed the superego is. The purpose of anxiety. Anxiety serves as a warning to the person that something is amiss within the personality. Anxiety induces tension in the organism and thus becomes a drive, much like hunger or thirst, that the individual is motivated to satisfy. Defenses against anxiety. The ego has to reduce the conflict between the demands and of the id and the strictures of society as represented by the superego. The defense mechanisms are the strategies of the ego uses to defend itself against the anxiety provoked by conflicts of everyday life. Defense mechanisms involve denials or distortions of reality. The example of defense mechanisms. Repressions involve unconscious denial of the existence of something that causes anxiety. The denial involves denying the existence of an external threat or traumatic event, while the reaction formation involves expressing an id impulse that is the opposite of one truly driving the person, while projection involves attributing a disturbing impulse to someone else, while regression involves retreating to an earlier, less frustrating period of life and displaying the childish and dependent behaviors characteristics of that more secure time, while rationalization involves reinterpreting behavior to make it more acceptable and less threatening, and displacement involves shifting id impulse from a threatening or unavailable object to substitute object that is available. And lastly, Sublimation involves altering and displaying id by diverting instinctual energy into socially acceptable behaviors. Lying to ourselves. As we have seen, these defense mechanisms are conscious denials or distortions of reality. We are lying to ourselves when we use these defenses, but we are not aware of doing so. Psychosexual stages of personality development. The psychosexual stages of development to Freud, it is the oral, anal, phallic, and genital stages through which all children pass. In these stages, gratification of the id instincts depends on the stimulation of corresponding areas of the body. Growing up is not easy. Freud argued that a person's unique character type develops in childhood, largely from parent-child interactions. Freud considered childhood experiences that he said that the adult personality was firmly shaped and crystallized by the age of 5. He derived his theory of the psychosexual stages of development. Each stage is defined by an erogenous zone of the body. Fixation is a condition in which a portion of libido remains invested in one of the psychosexual stages because of excessive frustration or gratification. The oral stage is the first stage of psychosexual development, lasts from birth until sometime during the second year. During this period, the infant's principal source of pleasure is the mouth. The infant derives pleasure from sucking, biting, and swallowing. The anal stage. Freud believed that the experience of toilet training during the anal stage had a significant effect on personality development. Defecation produces erotic pleasure for the child, but with the onset of toilet training, the child is put under pressure to learn to postpone or delay this pleasure. While the phallic stage is the focus of pleasure shifts from the anus to the genitals. The child faces battle between an id impulse and demands of society, as reflected in parental expectations. Pleasure is derived from the genital region, not only through behaviors such as masturbation, but also through fantasies. The Oedipus complex in boys is the basic conflict of the phallic stage centers on the unconscious desire of the child for the parent of the opposite sex. Accompanying this is the unconscious desire to replace or destroy the parent of the same sex. While the Oedipus complex in girls was a less clear about female phallic conflict, while some of his followers termed Oedipus complex as Electra complex. While the latency period, to Freud, the period from approximately age 5 to puberty, during which the sex instinct is dormant, sublimated in school activities, sports, and hobbies, and in developing friendships with members of the same sex. While the genital stage, this is the final psychosexual stage of development. It begins at puberty. The genital personality type is able to find satisfaction in love and work, the latter being an acceptable outlet for sublimation of the id impulse. The importance of childhood. Freud stressed the vital importance of early childhood years in determining the adult personality. According to Freud, the first 5 years are the crucial ones. To Freud, what we are as adults, how we behave, think, and feel is determined by the conflicts to which we are exposed and with which we must cope before many of us have learned to live. The questions about human nature. He argued that each person is a dark cellar of conflict in which a battle is continually raging. Human beings are depicted in gloomy, pessimistic terms, condemned to a struggle with our inner forces, which we are almost always destined to lose. In Freud's system, there's only one ultimate and necessary goal in life, which is to reduce tension. Assessment in Freud's theory. He considered the unconscious to be the major motivating force in life. It is the repository of all of our childhood conflicts which have been repressed out of conscious awareness. Free association. Freud's development of the technique of free association owes much to Joseph Breuer, a Viennese physician who befriended Freud during Freud's early years in private practice, a technique in which the patient says whatever comes to mind. In other words, it is a kind of daydreaming out loud. Free association is not always free. Resistance in free association, a blockage or refusal to disclose painful memories. Dream analysis. Freud believed that the dreams represent in symbolic form repressed desires, fears, and conflicts. So strongly have these feelings have been repressed that they can surface only disguised passion during sleep. The two aspects of dreams, which are the manifest content, which refers to the actual events in the dream, while the latent content, which is the hidden symbolic meaning of the dream. Uncovering conflicts. Both of these Freudian assessment techniques, which is the free association and dream analysis, revealed that the psychoanalysts a great deal of repressed material, but all of it is a disguise or symbolic form. Criticisms of Freud's research. Freud's major research method was the case study, which as we saw in chapter 1, has several limitations. A case study is a detailed history of an individual that contains data from a variety of sources. A fundamental criticism of Freud's case studies involves in the nature of his data. It is also possible that his session was selective and recorded only experiences that supported his theory or that he interpreted those experiences in ways that would support his theory. Other critics agree that Freud was suggesting accounts of childhood seduction without really hearing his patients say so. Another criticism of Freud's research is that it based on a small and unrepresentative sample of people. In addition, there may be discrepancies between Freud's notes on his therapy sessions and the case histories he published, which supposedly were based on these notes. The published version of the case did not agree with the notes Freud made after the sessions with the patient. It has been argued that none of Freud's handful of published case histories provides compelling supporting evidence for his theory. Freud's negative views on experimental research. Although Freud was familiar with the experimental method, he had little confidence in it, believing that scientific research and psychoanalysis are inherently incompatible. He believed that there was no need for the kinds of experiments published in the psychology journals of the day because they told him nothing more than he had already learned from his clinical encounters with patients. Freud wrote that psychoanalysis was based on incalculable number of observations and experiences, and only someone who has repeated those observations on himself and on others is in position to arrive at judgment of his own upon it. Scientific testing of Freudian concepts. The unconscious is the notion that unconscious forces can influence conscious thought and behavior is now well established. Psychologists also recognize that the much of information processing involved in cognitive activities is unconscious. Some even propose that the causal mechanisms underlying all behavior thought may be unconscious. The ego control, as you would expect from the name, is close to Freud's original conception. It refers to the amount of control we are able to exert over our impulses and feelings. The degree of ego control ranges from under control, in which we are unable to restrain any impulses and feelings, to over control, in which we are tightly inhibited the expression of our impulses. Both extremes are considered maladaptive. While ego resiliency refers to our flexibility in adjusting or changing our typical level of ego control to meet the daily changes in our environment. Repression research had provided support for the Freudian defense mechanisms of repression. In one study, subjects memorized two lists of words that were flashed on screen. Repressors and non-repressors. Repressors tend to be low in anxiety, high in defensiveness, and to have significantly poorer to recall of negative memories from childhood. In addition, repressors are far more likely to avoid romantic attachments than are non-repressors. Repressors have also been shown to be much more likely than non-repressors to deny possessing personality traits they had identified as personally emotionally threatening, such as selfishness, laziness, rudeness, and dishonesty. Repressors also had fewer unpleasant or threatening emotional memories available for retrieval than non-repressors because they had repressed them. The Freudian sleep. According to Freud, what appears to ordinary forgetting or causal lapse in speech is actually a reflection of unconscious motives or anxieties. Extensions of Freudian theory. Ego psychology of Anna Freud. Anna Freud, in 1895 to 1982, said she never would have been born if a safer contraceptive method had been available to her parents. Despite that beginning, she became the only one Freud seeks children to follow in his path. Anna was not ignored by her father. She became his favorite and by the age of 14 was dutifully attending meetings of the psychoanalytic group, listening attentively to the case histories being presented and discussed. At 22, Anna began 4 years of psychoanalysis with her father, who was later sharply criticized for analyzing his daughter. Another explained that no one would presume to undertake the task, for Anna's analysis would inevitably call into question Freud's role as her father. In her analysis, Anna reported violent dreams involving shooting, killing, and dying as well as defending her father from his enemies. Anna Freud joined the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, presenting a paper entitled Beating Fantasies and Daydreams. She devoted her life to take care of her father and to his system of psychoanalysis. Several years after he died, she described a series of dreams she had about him. And while Anna was close to death, some 40 years after her father died, she would sit in a wheelchair, wear his old wool coat, which she had kept all those years. Reflections on Freud's theory. The decline of Freudian psychotherapy. Freud's theory of personality remains more influential than his system of psychoanalytic. Although research in Freud's ideas and experimental tests of these concepts continue to be plentiful, psychoanalysis as therapeutic technique has declined in popularity, particularly in the United States. In China, however, psychoanalysis as a method of therapy has become more popular, using Skype, the internet video conferencing service, and the software application. Freudian psychoanalysis in the United States have offering training programs to a growing number of Chinese psychoanalysis. In some European countries, conducting traditional psychoanalytic sessions over the internet has also been growing rapidly with the initial reports of successful results. Criticisms of psychoanalysis. We have already noted that the flaws of the case study approach, Freud's primary method research in addition to those issues raised mainly by experimental psychologists, there are also questions asked by other personality theories. Others challenge Freud's focus on sex and aggressions as major motivating forces and believe that we are shaped more by social experiences than by sexual ones. Another criticism focuses on Freud's emphasis on past behavior to the exclusion of our goals and aspirations. Ambiguous definitions of certain Freudian concepts have also been questioned. Critics point to confusion and contradiction in such terms as id, ego, and superego. Freud's lasting influence. This book is a modern insights into personality. In our personal and social growth, we are never free to our past, nor should we want to be. The past offers the foundation on which to build. As later personality theories have built on Freud's work, if psychoanalysis had served no other purpose than to inspire others and provide a framework within which to develop new insights, then Freud's importance to the world of ideas is secure. Every structure depends on the soundness and integrity of its foundation. Sigmund Freud gave personality theories is a highly original and stimulating, challenging base on which to build. And that's all for today. Thank you and I hope you have learned something new for this today's discussion. Again, thank you and stay safe everyone.